So we're talking a little bit about the materials appropriate, the woods that are appropriate for doing a laser woodcut. This is an example of a woodcut that was cut on a piece of wood with the laser. You can see the halftone pattern that it created, and then it was rolled up with ink just like a regular wood block and printed on a piece of paper. So you can see right off the bat some different types of wood that I have here. I'll tell you that through experimentation, I have found that obviously different woods work better for woodcut. Some work better for etching and creating that sort of burned look. But if your ultimate goal is to create the wood block, then I suggest using a harder wood, such as this is maple. Nothing too hard like cherry, or you'll end up needing to maybe go multiple times through your etching process, and it'll take longer. This is also an appropriate piece of birch. You can find these at the hardware store if you go to, or like a lumber yard that has fine woods, better quality woods. You don't want to get pine. It's super soft. It has a lot of knots in it. You're going to have problems with pine. I would get something without any knots because you don't want to have that hard. Knots are very hard and they will interrupt your etch and actually not etch all the way deeply that you want. So find a piece, take your time, find a piece that doesn't have a lot of knots. And then, of course, go the extra mile and do tests. So I'll show you, just talk about some examples of this, I'll talk about some examples of what worked and what didn't. So in this case, this is a maple, but I didn't really etch it deep enough. And you can see kind of that it's pretty shallow. It's only like, I don't know, a millimeter down. And it worked, but it didn't get all this detail that I wanted to, because as I rolled my brayer across it, it picked up some of that part that should have been etched out. So having a test is a really good idea. Make sure that your settings on your laser are correct so that you don't do your whole project and then realize you have to do it again because it didn't etch deep enough or it etched too much. And in this case, you can see that it got way too deep. This board is much softer than the maple, and even if these might not have been the same settings, but it could have likely been the same settings. And you can just see how it totally obliterated a lot of that design because it was just too high a setting and the wood was too soft. So again, test, test, test. And then keep your tests, and right on the back, this one has what the settings were, whether it was the speed and the power, so that you know, oh, I can go back, and if I'm using the same type of wood, maybe write what type of wood it is, whether it was a vector or a bitmap or a raster. You should be able to tell that though from the image. So test, record your tests on your little test blocks. If it's too soft, it's going to just over etch and you'll lose all your detail, might even go all the way through. So make sure that you note your settings when you're cutting before you cut for your appropriate wood. I would not recommend using OSB. This is that press board, because it has glue in it and it definitely won't get an even look because there's too much going on here, too many different woods, too many thicknesses. It's not going to etch cleanly. So just like avoiding knots, avoid things that have a lot of different types of materials mixed in them. You can seal your wood prior to cutting, but I would make sure to seal it with a appropriate sealer like shellac or like an acrylic sealant. That way it's not going to, and then let it fully dry. because you don't want the alcohol in the shellac to start a fire in your laser. You want to make sure that it's totally dry before you stick it under the heat of the laser. But it really helps to prevent the ink from soaking into the wood. You can certainly seal it afterwards, but it might fill in some of the finer details. So coating it first before you put it in the laser is sometimes a good idea. But if you forget, you can always coat it afterwards. Spray it with an acrylic sealer or a shellac. Another type of wood that's pretty good is plywood. This is a birch plywood, and because the etching isn't going too deep, you can see that this is a pretty good depth. It's about 3 millimeters, and it will get a nice roll for you. You don't go too far into the plywood, so you don't have to worry about the glues and the different wood qualities in a plywood. But again, make sure you get the carpenter grade because you want to ensure that there's no knots and everything is as even as possible. You can easily clean this off, the soot off from the laser afterwards, but if you are worried about it, you can lay a piece of paper tape or contact paper over the top before you cut and then peel it off, but you will have to peel off all those little details that were left stuck on there. But if you're just going to be inking it up for a woodcut, then it's pretty easy to just clean it off with a soft brush, toothbrush, or a rag and a little bit of like oil, baby oil, and should be good to go. If you're wondering or if you're confused about the types of appropriate wood, again, just do a test, figure out whether you're on the right track or you should start over and look for something else. But that should give you a good start as to choosing your woods for your laser woodcut. So now we're going to talk about the types of materials. Just skim the surface of the appropriate materials you can use with the laser and some of the inappropriate materials. So first off, you can obviously use acrylic. This has a paper backing, which can be either kept on. In this case, it has been kept on, or you can remove it. I have not had a problem with the laser reflecting and bouncing off of my material. Some people recommend keeping this on there to avoid any kind of spray or like burning that might happen around the edges, and then you just peel it off afterwards. That's fine unless you have really tiny lettering, which can sometimes be a problem to pick off. Obviously it can be done. But when you have your plexiglass or acrylic, make sure that you know how thick it is and refer to the chart to see your settings for cutting or rastering. You may have to do a couple passes in order to cut all the way through a thicker piece of acrylic. In this case, we rastered the piece of acrylic. So it has an etched surface that we will be printing, and you can rub ink into it just like you can in intaglio, and it will have those gray tones. But I've purposely chosen a thicker piece of acrylic for this purpose because as it rasters, it heats up quite a bit, and you can see it warped a little bit. But if it's thinner, if it's something like 1/8 inch or even a little bit smaller, it will warp and bend if there's a lot of heat put on it. So just be aware of that and ultimately what you're going to be doing with it. You can use wood. This is a nice maple, and it etches quite nicely. Some of the different types of wood you'll see will show a grain more than others. This is a pine or a birch. And I always recommend doing a test because As you can see, I put on the back what that this was not a vector image, it was a raster image, and what the settings were for power and speed. That way you'll know if you want to replicate it exactly what it's going to look like on that particular piece of wood, because wood varies a lot. And between, say, this birch plywood, the thicker wood, and a maple, you'll get very different results because of the hardnesses of the wood. So again, do a test in a discrete area of the same material. Can't stress that enough. If you're concerned about the way that it's going to look. This is an example of a piece that was printed using a raster cut with the halftone pattern and then printed as a block print. So you can see the fine detail that you can get with the laser cut wood block. You can seal if you have something, especially if you're going to be doing wood cut, you can seal the surface first before etching it so that it doesn't soak up as much of the ink, protects it as well. But I would recommend that you check and make sure that whatever you're sealing it with won't be harmful, won't produce vapors. For instance, a shellac is what I used on this. That will be fine for putting through the laser. It's a natural material. It is alcohol-based, but when it's dry and sealed, it's not going to cause a fire and flame up, unless you do it and then don't wait until it's dry. If you paint it on and then stick it in the laser right away, then you would probably potentially cause a fire because the alcohol hasn't evaporated. So be aware of that. If you're going to seal it, don't seal it with anything like lacquer-based or what's the other? Enamel potentially, because the paint in those materials, the VOCs, could cause harmful vapors that wouldn't get sucked out all the way through the exhaust. So again, try to use common sense, look at the MSDS, understand if there's something that's going to have harmful materials that could either catch fire or produce harmful vapors. I wouldn't recommend etching with this OSB though, because it's so uneven and you don't exactly know what types of wood these are. It's not going to produce a consistent result. And there might even be glue in there that you don't realize is in there and could damage your project or the machine. So I would not recommend using OSB for the laser. Let's see. You can certainly cut paper as well. If you want to cut an intricate design out of paper, using blue tape to tape your mother piece of paper down onto the honeycomb table is appropriate. That way, as the exhaust fan blows it, it doesn't blow your paper off, which can sometimes happen. So taping your piece down, as they cut out the shapes, sometimes they'll blow away or under the paper, and that's fine. You just want to make sure that your laser is set, and if there is a part like this that's popping up, that's taped down as well, because it will, that difference in height will affect the focus of your laser, and you either won't get a clean cut or it won't even cut at all. So. All right, there are many other types of materials that you can use, but that's just some of the most common. Refer to the chart if you're at all unsure about what to cut, and if you can cut it at all.